Is part 4 of Unit 4, your last section of the class. This last section, just a few slides, each song is very different from one another. There's a lot of variety, and it's really just a summary of many things going on, particularly in the late 80s into the early 90s, which is, as you'll read in your text, a huge explosion of genres and subgenres, and the music industry is changing and the listenership is changing. So the first group we're going to talk about is REM from Georgia. And notice this is their category of indie rock. In the previous sections, when we got to U2, the term alternative rock was in their slide as a category. These are two terms that are very difficult to define. I think that indie might be slightly more easy to define, in that it stems from independent labels, underground music, smaller, more regional audiences. But then again, these bands, particularly REM, who have longevity, have a huge international and national following. So they're not in itself remaining small, but those are its origins. Alternative, on the other hand, does not necessarily speak to a particular musical style. It is usually acts that were not in what's called the mainstream of sound. But then again, radio stations and record stores use the term alternative for not really having a place to put some of those bands. So the same can be said for indie rock. It is not a particular sound. It really defines more of an origin of the band. Probably the longest lasting indie band, though, was REM up until 4 or 5 years ago when they retired, or they stopped being a band. The meaning of this song, The One I Love from '87, is often misunderstood. It's a very dark song about using someone in your life rather than really truly loving them. In fact, the line, "a simple prop to occupy my time," that's pretty grim. I say this with a little bit of caution. Those that are married have not had to deal, or won't have to deal with this hopefully ever again. But those of you who will be married someday, as a performer at weddings for a big part of my earlier career, it is shocking sometimes what a bride and groom will select as wedding music for either their ceremony, or I'm not a wedding singer. I didn't do receptions, but I often did what is called prelude music, or even exit music for those that may not have had a church wedding. They might have just rented out a hall, or this song sometimes was selected, particularly because I'm a piano player. It can be toned down from the Michael Stipe version of almost yelling the word fire to a rather pretty piano piece. But be aware that this probably isn't the greatest sentiment to have hanging over your wedding. Michael Stipe himself, the lead singer for REM, has said that it was an incredibly violent song, and then said it is very clear that it is about using people over and over again. Don't pick this for your wedding. The other one is the "Every Breath You Take" by the Police, which is sometimes subtitled the Stalker Song. It is not about a healthy love addiction at any level. It is about really someone obsessing over another person. I've had everything from the Police song I mentioned requested to, I had a colleague of mine who was an opera singer, and we were both hired as a team for a bride and groom who wanted to have the music of Phantom of the Opera as the kind of theme of their wedding, which is their business. Their money was green. Pardon me. But they wanted the bride to walk down the aisle they created to a song from the Broadway musical Phantom of the Opera called Masquerade, which is a very big number and the whole company is involved. But the sentiment behind it is that we hide behind our falsehoods. Again, not a great sentiment for a wedding. So That's my 2 cents on wedding music. Listen to the one I love. Listen for the simplicity of it, actually. It's only 3 verses that repeat, but there's a lot of emotion, a lot of intensity, especially when Michael Stipe sings and almost yells the word fire over and over again. And then come back. One of the post-punk offshoots and a style of music that really started to blend the importance of electronics, digital sounds, and sampled sounds and synthesized sounds, and really a true balance between electronic and analog, I guess we would say, sounds is called industrial rock. And oftentimes these are individuals in their home recording studios, on their computers, with digital audio workstations, creating fascinating sounds. Stigmata by Ministry is an excellent example of that. Ministry is actually an individual, as was Nine Inch Nails' Trent Reznor as an individual. But when those gentlemen, Jorgensen is the last name of the creator of Ministry, and Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails were to perform as their group in person, they would have a team of people on stage, of course, for some of the live instruments that are part of their music. There's a really fascinating thing, I think, to industrial rock. It really blends some pretty jarring sounds, both from live instruments and from electronic manipulation. Electronic sounds have to be warmed up. That's the best way for me to explain it. If you've ever been given a hearing test, they usually put on some headphones. I remember this as a kid in school. They would play tones very faint and then sometimes louder, and you were supposed to tell them what you could and could not hear. Those most generally are called sine waves, and they're a pure digital tone. They're cold. Their purpose in a hearing test is not to interest us as a consumer of music. They're testing our hearing. But the industrial rock artists understood the cold nature of digital, purely created tones. So it was up to them how much they wanted to warm it up by adding reverb, by adding vibrato, by adding harmonics into the actual sound, and changing the shape of the wave of the sound. And without getting too complicated, it's most digital music we hear that is not purposely cold has been really manipulated quite extensively to warm it up for the human ear. The term stigmata has multiple meanings. It means something in Christianity as the marks of Christ. Jorgensen uses it slightly differently in this particular song. Stigmata generally means that a person's flesh has been pierced or otherwise invaded by a foreign object. The vocalist constantly screams about trying to get something out of his eyes, along with other references to such things as chewing on and being cut with glass and walking on splinters. The pain and anger are directed at someone who has lied to him. So this is a huge amount of emotion about betrayal and anger, and you could hear that in the way he uses, not only manipulates his voice, in some cases completely stripping out all the bottom end to give it a really strange, otherworldly treble sound, to the different manipulated industrial sounds he uses, including actual tools that he worked into the mix by sampling them and manipulating them. So listen to Stigmata, probably not on the loudest volume unless you're familiar with the song, and come back, please. One of the most exciting things that happened, I think, in guitar-based rock and roll was the explosion in the early 90s of what later became called grunge rock. That particular title was not particularly liked by a lot of the people in the category, including Nirvana, and it actually stemmed from clothing, from places like Seattle and Portland and little colder climates where a look of layers and sometimes even rips and tears became kind of a grungy look. And so that prominence of bands and popularity and a new sound from these areas kind of forced the title grunge rock. There are many, many bands in this category, and I think that Pacific Northwest Sound, which was probably a better title, is could take up a huge portion of a semester as well, because it really is an influence coming from not only its surrounding areas of some of the pioneers of the Seattle time frame, like the Sonics, and even Heart, who was a Seattle band, and of course Jimi Hendrix is a Seattleite. But a lot of the Midwest college kind of sound kind of made its way to smaller towns like Seattle, and I don't mean that in a diminutive way, but compared to LA or New York or Miami or Chicago or even, San Francisco, Seattle was considered not on the standard kind of tour cycle up until very, after this time period. The lyrics were pretty important to the listener of this kind of music. The bands within the category of grunge have very wide degrees of sounds. But what's exciting is that finally the intensity of punk rock, probably coming through bands like the Melvins and some of the other early influencers of grunge rock, and heavy metal with its virtuosic players, really formed this new wonderful combo of sounds. And I would say that maybe Soundgarden displays a tiny bit more of the heavy metal influence, depending on the song you pick. I think there's a little more of the punk aesthetic and maybe in Nirvana, especially in a band like Screaming Trees, which is from this time period, or Mudhoney, which is also a little bit earlier than this. They have a little more of the punk intensity to them. But finally, a fan could go to a club once this kind of this style became more popular and not as underground, and you could have long hair, you could have short hair, you could have a mohawk, you could have piercings, you could not, you could wear leather, you could look like either metal or punk, and it would be okay. Prior to this, in the 70s in particular, there was a lot of fighting between those two scenes, and it was not particularly pretty. Kurt Cobain is the leading frontman for Nirvana, and I guess the creator of the band. He had a number of names he wanted to call it before settling on the name Nirvana. It's easily looked up in Google. They become the voice of a generation that felt that the music was not representing them at this time, and that would be the Gen Xers. My pen. The Gen X generation. So not baby boomers any longer, but the very next generation after that, who would now be probably, I'm guessing, into their early 40s. I don't know the exact years for Gen X, but they didn't resonate with mainstream music necessarily, and the ideas of alienation and individuality and feeling like the future was dim seemed to really come out in the music of this time period and this particular area, and this band in particular. Kurt Cobain had a very difficult upbringing. He had a family that split. He felt very misunderstood. He was homeless for a period of time. He goes back to his high school 1 year after he should have graduated and has a job there as a janitor. And just imagine that for a moment, because many of you have been much more recently in high school than myself, what it would have felt like to go back the very next year to clean toilets or dump the trash. So that's got to be tough. And in fact, the video for Smells Like Teen Spirit shows a janitor in kind of an homage to that time in his life. He was a troubled young man. He had serious addiction issues. He had physical ailments that some speculate he may have been self-medicating with heroin, his drug of choice, unfortunately, and his demise as well. His demise is a bit controversial. I don't personally choose to promote conspiracy theories, but I don't think we have all the details completely on his passing. The official record is that he shot himself and is a suicide in the upper room of his home in Seattle. Again, not going to take classroom time to go into all the different details. It's a fascinating read, but again, we have a lot of, unfortunately, false information in a lot of areas of life lately. So you can watch certain documentaries. There's a couple of books out about it, and make up your own minds on that one. But Smells Like Teen Spirit has some really interesting elements, including a really interesting harmonic progression for the opening chords. The sound of Nirvana is sometimes categorized as soft loud, which is really coming from a Boston-based band called the Pixies. And in fact, Dave Grohl, this fellow right here, was not their original drummer, but he's the most prominent drummer. Often was afraid that Smells Like Teen Spirit was a bit of a ripoff of a Pixies song, but it becomes the very, very, very huge hit. And there's a fourth person who should be recognized because he did a lot of work with Nirvana. He didn't do as much of the live touring when the three other guys, Chris Novoselic and Dave Grohl and Kurt Cobain, were together, but he did do a lot of studio work for them, and he was present and played on the MTV Unplugged performance that Nirvana did, and his name is Pat Smear. He's a current member in the Foo Fighters. He was a member of an LA punk band called The Germs. He was part of one of the other Seattle bands. It wasn't Green River. I would have to look up his CV, but Mother Love Bone, possibly? This man, Pat Smear, has been in the history of rock throughout a long period of time, and he's a really excellent guitarist. So look into Pat Smear. But now listen to Smell Like Teen Spirit, and please come back. Now we get a couple of women from this late 80s, early 90s time period, actually early 90s and late 90s, pardon me, and Ani DeFranco and Lauryn Hill. And they're going to be kind of compared and contrasted to one another because there's similarities to the thematic nature of their songs. Not a Pretty Girl is really a response to a man who had wronged Ani DeFranco, and it ends up being a general statement about how women are treated in a larger context from her perspective. She is in a category called alternative. Remember, not part of mainstream. They slapped that alternative title onto all kinds of things. Alternative folk singer-songwriter. And you can hear that very prominently in the song Not a Pretty Girl. She is a more low-tech kind of performer. That does not mean it's bad quality. She doesn't go for all the big production value in some of her music. Lauryn Hill is in a category that's called alternative hip-hop. She was part of the Fugees for a brief time, and then the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill is her solo album that's a masterpiece. If you have not listened to it, take some time and do so. She is a combination of all kinds of influences from the 50s, R&B, lots of interesting, even jazz, you could say, is an influence to the music that she sings and creates. She utilizes some horns. She is directing part of her song, Doo-Wop, That Thing, towards women that needed to have a little higher standards and don't accept the unacceptable all the time. And then she has kind of a direct, near the second half, towards the men in her community, her social community, her listener community. Stop treating women so poorly. Why do all the hip hop lyrics keep talking about women in really derogatory terms? And we've all heard it. So please compare the two. It's an interesting comparison, how their messages are very similar, but presented to slightly different audiences in a slightly different manner. And come back. By the time we get into the 90s, the word pop is not a bad word anymore when it's connected to punk. This was in contention because some of what seemed to be what punk was rebelling against in the 70s was commercialization, and that is an element that was part of the rebellious nature of punk rock. But lots has changed in the business, and lots will continue to change in the business. Some even say that really what the Ramones was doing was pop punk in its core, in its essence. And they were a huge influence to this group, Green Day, who is not unapologetic about the pop punk title. They're proud to have it and wear it. What becomes more pop in it is maybe a broader audience, but some of it is song structure, memorability of the songs, sometimes more catchy hooks and riffs in some ways, and that's really the case for sure for Green Day. This is from the album Dookie, When I Come Around, from 1994, and Dookie was named after potty humor. So apparently the guys on tour had some bad food, and they all got upset tummies and diarrhea. So a dookie is actually a type of poop. There's lots of humor in the case of Green Day. They continue to make music to the present day, and Billie Joe Armstrong actually has side projects that are quite interesting if you follow this kind of music. Pop punk, you could say in the category, would also fit Sum 41, Blink 182. There's a lot of other bands that have carried that label quite proudly without any problem. So this is the themes of a promiscuous male's treatment of his lonely girlfriend. Come back and after you listen to When I Come Around, and we'll continue on Unit 4. One of the other categories that continues to the present moment is progressive rock. In the hands of the 70s artists, it was largely dominated by the Brits, Pink Floyd, Yes, Genesis, many others. And they still tend to dominate in that area, although Canada has a number of acts that are strong progressive rock acts, as well as Iceland, and other regions, Australia, New Zealand. Tame Impala would definitely, I would say, be in this category. And he is, I believe, either an Aussie or a New Zealander. Someone else will probably know. But this is a Radiohead who comes into prominence really in the early 90s-ish, but not in the widespread phenomenon they do by the time that they are creating their kind of epic album, OK Computer. They are British. The song Karma Police is playing off of the George Orwell's book 1984, and the idea of the thought police, that they will measure everything that you think or do. They use a lot of mixture of acoustic instruments, electronic manipulation with actual computerized music, and even an analog synthesizer for parts of what the choir noises, or what it sounds like voices in the background. They're actually created with an analog synthesizer. So synthesizing music, creating it from nothing, began with tubes and wires and now is a digital process. But there is a difference in the sound of an analog synthesizer and a digital synthesizer. So OK Computer celebrated a 20th anniversary 3 years ago, and there were some interesting signs that would show up some of the lyrics of some of the other tracks on this album in subway areas of New York City, and unusual. They have an unusual marketing philosophy. They're one of the first groups to release an album entirely on the internet for free for a select period of time, and they have a massive following of fans. So listen to Karma Police and come back, please. Another fusion of styles is rap rock, which is somewhat self-explanatory. Heavy rap delivery for the lyrical content mixed with heavy rock sounds, and I think that no band really exudes that as much as Rage Against the Machine, who has just recently announced a reunion, which is exciting for fans who have wondered what's been going on with the rest of their years of not making music there, Tom Morello and Zach De La Rocha. This is from '96, and it is highly politicized subject matter. This is a very political song. The angry lyrics are both strongly anti-militaristic and critical of politicians who would invoke family values in their campaigns while having shells, presumably spent bullet shells, in their pockets to represent their real interest in backing wars. This music is coming out during the Gulf conflicts. We'd already had the Gulf War I, and we had not experienced 9/11 quite yet. There are pointed references against a preference for military spending over domestic spending, buying weapons instead of food, homes, or shoes, for example. The destruction of the library, there's a mention of it in the lyrics, has a dual image of an actual military attack as well as the effect of a cutoff of funding to a library. There are also allusions to environmental degradation as a sore on the earth, and a thinly veiled political reference to the Republican Party, whose mascot is an elephant. A male elephant is the bull that is on parade in the song. Other allusions to the song also connect the bull to Wall Street. The bullish, being bullish, is doing well on Wall Street. The lyrics aren't as easy to understand just on a listening, so if you have the time, you may want to pull them up to follow along. They definitely use profanity in their music, not as much in this one as in some of the others. But pause and listen to Bulls on Parade by Rage Against the Machine, and we'll continue onward. So this next category, nu metal, which often has an umlaut, which are the two dots used in the German language, and I was not able to find them too easily from my slide, so is a contentious category. It can have similarities to rap rock in that some of the vocal delivery is speech-like, what we refer to as declamatory, but it's not solely that, and that's often the case with Korn, as we're going to talk about Freak on a Leash. They're a local band. They are from the South Orange County area. In fact, I have had students in my Saddleback classes before who have delivered pizzas to one of the band members that has a home, not in Nellygale, but somewhere near, apparently. They are, I believe, also attend Saddleback Church when we have the ability to meet in groups again. And they came to their religious conversion, I guess I'll say, or changing their ways because of heavy drug use and almost dying, and then having a family and realizing you would not be around for that kid would be very, very tragic. And so most of the band, if not all of them, have cleaned themselves up and gone in a religious direction with their lives. Freak on a Leash has a little bit of that in its thematic quality. It's again about alienation, and there's a lot of fear and intensity in it. The animated video that went along with this particular song was requested so much that MTV had to stop it in the rotation for TRL, Total Request live show they used to have. But it's really interesting and well crafted. It kind of follows, unfortunately, it's kind of like the life of a bullet. I don't know how else to describe it. If you have time, watch the video. It's kind of an interesting one. The themes are an anguished soul cries out from an earthly hell marked by a sense of being controlled by unseen forces, which is the leash. He can fall no lower, yet something in him resists his condition and inspires him to fight his condition. So I do think that there's some truth in that theme for some of the band members of Korn. So listen and come back briefly, and we are right near the end. Okay, friends, if you've made it to this slide, you've made it to the end of our class. I can't believe it. It went by very, very quickly. And even under the not ideal circumstances of having to shift everything to remote instruction, everybody did a great job and hung in there. So this is the end of Unit 4. You've made it to the finish line as far as your lecture is concerned and your slides are concerned. Don't forget there will be an assignment to finish for this last unit about predicting the future of music. If you're completing this early, I may have not put it up yet, but if you're completing it closer to the quiz opening time, your assignment should be there in Canvas. So I hope you've had a wonderful experience in Music 28, and it's one of my favorite classes to teach. I love to go into more detail on every single artist covered, but time just doesn't permit for that. So wishing you all a very safe and prosperous and healthy summer.